Hello, I'm Malin Pinsky, and I am re-recording or re re-talking through the first part of my lecture on the ecological impacts of marine heat waves, so it can be recorded. So you'll see halfway through, I'm going to magically switch my attire and my background and everything else because the first time through, we only recorded the first half, or the second half, I mean. So I lead the Global Change Research Group at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where I'm an associate professor. But my path to get here has been a little bit circuitous. I had an undergrad degree in biology and environmental studies and got really interested in environmental conservation. So I actually worked for 3 years after college, first for a international marine conservation group and later for a North Pacific wide salmon conservation group, mostly doing salmon conservation planning. And in that process, it seemed to me like a lot of the people that I sort of looked up to in a career sense had PhDs within conservation groups. So I went back for a PhD, largely thinking I was going to go into work for a conservation NGO. Got my PhD at Stanford University in biology, but mostly focusing on marine questions. Did a David Smith Conservation Research Fellowship at Princeton University with focused especially on climate issues. And then I was faculty at Rutgers University for about a decade before moving just over 12 months ago to University of California, Santa Cruz. I stayed in academia largely because I realized I really love doing research and I really love mentoring students. And I also realized that academic research, when connected to conservation, can really make a difference too. So I know you've had a bunch of really cool lectures, some of which I've been able to listen to, but some of them I've missed over the past 8 days or so, almost a week and a half. Many of them have been on the physical oceanography around marine heat waves, and today I want to provide a bit more of a broad structure to think about the ecological and biological impacts of marine heat waves. I know you've had some really cool examples around seabirds and corals and right whales. And I'll end the lecture today talking a bit about impacts on continental shelf ecosystems, and as well as species important to fisheries. So you've seen many versions of this figure over the last week and a half, where we have surface temperature anomalies shown on the vertical axis for the last 150 years. One of the things that's a little bit different in this figure is that I've broken out the land surface in red from the ocean surface in blue. And you'll see that the land surface has warmed just about 1.6 degrees Celsius, whereas the ocean surface has only warmed about 0.9 degrees Celsius. That has some interesting implications right there. One, it means that ocean warming is less severe for species that live in the ocean. But one of the other interesting things is that the ocean temperatures just in general are much less variable through time than are temperatures on land. Water has a high specific heat, so it's slow to warm up and slow to cool down. So we're talking about extreme events, but it's also helpful to keep in mind the historical variability that these species have evolved in. And in the ocean, marine species have evolved in an environment that doesn't change temperature all that much. So even though the ocean surface is only warmed about 0.9 degrees Celsius, it's actually a lot compared to the historical variability that these species have experienced. The focus of this workshop, though, is how do species cope with fast warming and short extreme events? And one of the really interesting biological questions is how do long-term warming trends integrate with these short-term extreme events? and how do biological systems integrate those two forms of change over different timescales, and also sometimes different magnitudes. So the lecture today is broken up into 3 parts. First, I'll talk about different kinds of ecological responses to temperature variability. This applies both to long-term and short-term, but I'll be presenting it in the context of short-term extreme events, marine heat waves. And so these different scales are also different processes that allow species to adapt or limit species' ability to cope with marine heat waves. I then want to talk about inference and how we make inference about the ecological impacts of marine heat waves. How do we test hypotheses against data, and different ways we can think about making inference and what different kinds of evidence mean. And finally, give an example from applying one of these approaches to detecting marine heat wave impacts across continental shelf ecosystems, and what that's starting to tell us about the ways in which these species that live on continental shelf ecosystems cope with marine heat waves. So, as I mentioned, you've heard a lot about the physics and some striking examples, but now I want to provide a bit of a broader framework for how we think about the mechanisms that species use for coping with marine heat waves. So at the most basic, we can think about physiological tolerance of particular species or organisms in particular within different populations. And we can think about that physiological tolerance in terms of a thermal performance curve. So we can measure performance in different ways, partly depending on which process we're interested in, but also which process practically we can actually measure. So performance is sometimes measured in terms of respiration rates or photosynthesis rates, rates of prey capture, rates of predator avoidance, or growth. You can think of other ones as well. Those add up to affect 2 key demographic processes: reproduction and survival. And those 2 things, those 2 processes, together define the fitness of an organism. They have to be able to survive and leave offspring to the next generation. One of the really interesting things about thermal performance curves is illustrated in with this curve right here, which is that it's skewed towards low temperatures. It has a long tail towards cold temperatures. So it's as you move from the cold side of this graph to the warm side, there's a slow ramp up and then a very rapid drop off on the hot side. What it means is that a little bit of warming can actually be very impactful for species that are already living close to their upper thermal limit. Particular points on this graph are sometimes given particular names. So the upper limit, sometimes called a critical thermal limit, critical thermal maximum, I should say, CT max. It's also a lower limit, CT min. And then a thermal optimum is the point, the highest point right in the middle there. So because these curves are skewed, it depends a lot. The impact of warming depends on where you start. So you start close to the optimum and warm by a bit. That can be a large negative effect on performance. On the other hand, if an organism starts sufficiently below that thermal optimum, warming and a marine heat wave could actually improve performance and lead to higher fitness for a given organism. So therefore, where a species is before a marine heat wave hits helps define whether a given species is a quote-unquote winner, they do well in a marine heat wave, or a loser, a species that does not do well during a marine heat wave. The next process to think about is what we call physiological plasticity or acclimation. And this is the idea that a thermal performance curve is not set in stone. So a species that over some period of time, weeks to months in many cases for many organisms, can actually acclimate and change the location or shape of its thermal performance curve. In many cases, in the case of a marine heat wave, that would be to shift its thermal performance curve a bit higher. So the physiological mechanisms that underlie thermal acclimation often involve changes in protein composition, the fluidity of cell membranes, and also the composition of cell cytoplasm. And as an example of acclimation for us, think about yourself. If you were to work out a lot, if you do a lot of exercises, you'll get stronger. Your muscles will get bigger. That's also a form of acclimation. In this case, too, exercise though, rather than high temperature. A third important mechanism is behavioral thermoregulation. So this is the idea that through changes in behavior and habitat choice and choice of location for an organism, it can change the thermal environment that it experiences. The figure I'm showing you here is from a nice paper. It came out in 2016 in the Journal of Animal Ecology, where they were tracking the location of Atlantic cod in a fjord in Norway. And they did this over the course of a few months, including a warm period when the surface temperatures in this fjord were quite hot. So you can see in July, August, September, those surface temperatures in red were very warm. And those black dots show where the cod were recorded. You can see they're largely deeper. So the vertical axis here is depth. The cod were staying deep, except during some cooler spells when colder temperatures were found higher in the water column, especially in July. You can see that the cod moved up in the water column to shallower parts of the fjord during the times when it wasn't quite so hot in those shallows. And then if you move over to October, November, December, the cod moved into those shallows when it was cold in general. And in this particular environment, there's less food down deep. It's rocky and sandy, and more food present in the shallows. There are eelgrass and algae beds with host a lot of the prey that cod like to eat. So they prefer to be in the shallows from a food perspective, but they're excluded by high temperatures. But they can avoid overheating by staying deeper in the water. One of the interesting things is that in general, we actually don't know a whole lot about behavioral thermoregulation for marine species. So a lot of work, really fascinating work that's been done, especially with reptiles on land, showing that they move into the shade to avoid really hot temperatures in the sun. Though one of the costs can be that it provides less time for them to then search for food, which may be present in the sunnier areas. So there can be a trade-off that an organism has to make. Either staying in cooler areas with less food or moving into hotter areas that have more food. And that the ability for a species to do that in the ocean, part of the reason that isn't terribly well known is that first, we don't track a whole lot of marine species at the fine temporal and spatial resolution that we need to understand this. But also, we don't actually understand the fine scale thermal environment that many marine species inhabit. A lot of our oceanographic models, for example, are at a coarser spatial scale than individual organisms like a fish or a crab or even a copepod is experiencing and moving around in, I should say. So this point is just making that point a little bit more clearly. Just that how effective behavioral thermoregulation is depends on that mosaic of locals, and also on how mobile individual species are, their ability to move into cooler environments, and also the trade-off with not being as close to their food or the resources they need. Okay, so a fourth process I want to talk about is adaptive evolution. So evolution is typically thought to happen over very long spans of time, millions of years, and yet we also know that evolution can happen over very short periods of time, and often actually it happens in response to extreme events. like a marine heat wave. So if you think about not just a thermal performance curve for one individual organism, but actually thermal performance curves for a range of individuals within a population, because of different genotypes within those organisms, and they have thermal performance curves that are slightly different shapes and centered at different places along the temperature gradient. So there's a range of genotypes in that population. With an extreme event, an extreme marine heat wave, that may kill off or lead to lack of reproduction for genotypes adapted to cold temperatures. This is thought to have happened particularly for corals exposed to large-scale bleaching events. So you're left with surviving or reproducing genotypes that can tolerate higher temperatures. So that's a rapid selective event. If then that leads to reproduction and growth of that population again, because that mortality or lack of reproduction event is a strong cost of selection. So if the population can recover from that cost and grow again, then adaptive evolution can lead to what we call evolutionary rescue. Population has evolved to tolerate higher temperatures and evolved to maybe tolerate a marine heat wave. So as I said, evolution is often thought to be relatively slow, but an extreme event can lead to a very strong, abrupt selection event. The ability to recover is going to depend on the generation time of an organism. So what is the generation time of marine species? Well, it varies dramatically. Adaptive evolution is going to be most relevant for species with very short generation times. But for, some phytoplankton in the ocean, that generation time can be on the order of days or maybe weeks to months. This plot right here is showing specifically mortality on the vertical axis, but we can convert mortality into lifespan. 1/, mortality rate is the lifespan for an organism. So I've labeled where on this axis 2 days would be a 1-year lifespan or even a 150-year lifespan. And you can see in those, especially in those dark green dots, are lifespans based on body mass in particular for a number of phytoplankton. Some invertebrates also have, especially short-lived zooplankton, have short generation times as well. So a case where adaptive evolution and evolutionary rescue over the course of marine heat wave actually might be relevant. Very poorly understood though. So really fascinating area for more research. Another key mechanism that I want to mention are shifts in species distributions across larger geographic areas. So if we think about a species distribution spread across thermal gradients, often conceptualized in terms of latitude, colder temperatures towards the poles, higher temperatures towards the equator. That trailing edge would be towards the equator. That leading edge would be towards the pole, either North Pole or South Pole. But during a marine heat wave, new habitats that are suitable for a species may open up closer to the poles. They may extend their range during that marine heat wave. At the same time, that trailing edge, those populations or those individuals at that trailing edge may be extirpated. So that trailing edge may actually contract towards higher latitudes or in other directions, but along a thermal gradient. Then the question after a marine heat wave is what happens? Does that extended range persist in place even when the heat wave goes away? And if that trailing edge experienced extirpation and contraction, is the species able to reestablish those trailing edge populations that are maybe suitable again, even though they weren't suitable during the marine heat wave? So there are two important processes here, both range extension and range contraction, then the mirror, the potentially contraction back at the leading edge after the heat wave, or possibly persistence, and possible reestablishment if that trailing edge was extirpated. Again, the extent to which this happens is not well understood for most marine species. There is, however, substantial potential for geographic shifts during a marine heat wave. This is plots from a paper by Mike Jaycox a few years ago, came out in Nature. And the colors in the map on your left show the median thermal displacement. So how far did a given temperature move during marine heat waves over the last 4 decades or so? And many of those blues and blue colors are hundreds of kilometers. All the way up, though, in those white areas, we're talking about close to 1,000 kilometers or even more. And that happens because there's a very weak spatial gradient in temperatures, especially in the marine tropics. So if temperatures go up a full degree Celsius, organisms would have to travel a long distance horizontally to find that same temperature at the ocean surface. That displacement is very large horizontally because the spatial gradient in temperature is very weak. In contrast, when there's a very steep and very strong spatial gradient in temperatures, temperature may go up a degree Celsius, but an organism would only have to move slightly in order to find the equivalent temperature in a warmer environment. That's why we see large thermal displacement in the tropics. But as this illustrates, a large potential for that displacement during marine heat waves. So if species do extend their range or contract their ranges, that leads to new species arriving in a location or departing from a location that they've been historically. That leads to turnover in a given location in the species composition. So that's a community level consequence. So one way to think about these mechanisms is that they are acting across different scales of time and space. And time in this case is defined in terms of generations. So an organism with a very short generation time, that'll be less time measured in terms of months, so maybe more relevant for marine heat waves. And a species that has high mobility, so a larger body size, will be able to move in general longer distances and therefore can move over larger spatial scales, more relevant over the spatial scales and time scales of a marine heat wave. But over those shortest scales of space and time, especially in a given location over short periods of time, physiological tolerance is most relevant. Physiological plasticity operates over slightly longer periods of time, though for many species that's still going to be relevant for marine heat waves. We can also think about changes in timing, relevant mostly for long-term change, but potentially relevant during marine heat waves as well. Adaptive evolution operates over multiple generations. And so all of these mechanisms together are what allow a species to persist in place, along with over slightly larger spatial scales, or spatial scales of an individual moving. Behavioral thermoregulation allows an individual to persist and therefore a population to persist in a given location. If we think about larger spatial scales, though, organisms can move into different microclimates. Maybe that's deeper along a thermal gradient, or into slightly cooler parts of their larger landscape they live within. Maybe moving over larger depth gradients, or even moving over latitudinal gradients, sort of at the largest spatial scales. And as I mentioned, especially for organisms with larger body sizes and greater mobility, that may be especially relevant, even over the relatively short timescales of marine heat wave. So as I mentioned, these mechanisms along the bottom that operate over sort of local spatial scales, those are relevant for a trailing edge of a species distribution to persist in place, whereas these other larger scale geographic shifts allow a leading edge of a species range to expand into a new location. So in the class, I then asked everyone to spend some time, and if you're listening to this after the fact, please spend some time on your own thinking about what are the most important biological responses to marine heat waves. And I've listed the ones I've talked about here: physiological tolerance, plasticity, behavior, evolution, range shifts, and species turnover. In the class, we then shared our thoughts with our neighbor and then shared out with the whole group some of our overarching thoughts. I'm going to skip over that for now, but please do pause the video if you're listening to this after and spend some time reflecting yourself. One of the things you may realize is that the question is a bit ambiguous. That's intentionally so. Like what you define as important is going to differ depending on the person, and that variation between people, between study systems, is also interesting and relevant. One interesting hypothesis that's out in the literature right now, this is a paper by Felton et al., came out a couple of years ago in Ecology Letters, is that the importance and sort of magnitude of adaptation that can happen with a given process increases with the time scale over which that process operates. So physiology operates very rapidly. It's going to be most relevant for species coping with marine heat waves, but may have quite limited provide relatively limited ability for a species to cope with a marine heat wave. Plasticity, a little bit less relevant because it's slower, but provides greater ability all the way up sort of the hierarchy of processes. This particular example was for terrestrial systems involving forests and the ecosystem processes and feedbacks with soils, which is why they're up here. But it is interesting to think about whether this also applies to marine heat waves. And I want to emphasize that this is a hypothesis. We don't know if this is actually true on land or in the ocean. So I'm going to end the recording there because I think, fingers crossed, this is where the recording started in the live lecture. Okay, so the second part of, and that's part of why I think this field of research is so fascinating right now. It's a very active area of research. So I want to talk briefly about inference, about how we make inference about marine heat waves. You heard a lot about the physics of marine heat waves, how we define a marine heat waves, different ways of defining heat waves, as well as some really clear examples where heat waves had strong biological impacts, and we can trace those biological impacts back through the biological processes, but in some cases also the physical processes that led to those impacts. Seabirds, whales, corals. There are, and we have, other examples, really dramatic loss of kelps, for example, with some marine heat waves. These are down in Australia and Tasmania. The warm blob that you've heard quite a bit about, the picture on the right are just a huge aggregation of red swimming crabs that appeared, pelagic red swimming crabs that appeared on the beach at Hopkins Marine Station, the other end of Monterey Bay from where I am now. During the warm blob, a species that's normally found much further south, but appeared in large numbers. The picture on the right is a whale entangled in Dungeness crab pot fishing lines. So one of the consequences of the warm blob was whales coming further inshore in search of their prey and coming directly through Dungeness crab fishing grounds at a time when there are lots of crab pots out in the water, and that led to a spike in whale entanglements. A lot of concern about increased whale mortality. So novel human wildlife conflict as a result of these heat waves. So we know they can be really impactful. Exactly what it is about a heat wave that leads to that impact, though, is still not entirely clear. Is it duration of the heat wave? So it has enough time to build up that ecological and biological impact. Is it the cumulative intensity? Another way of thinking about a heat wave where you sort of sum up the area under that heat wave curve above some threshold. And Alistair Hobday talked about different ways of defining that threshold, often based on a percentile, a daily percentile from historical climatologies. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's the speed of onset, or maybe it's the maximum intensity, or what makes some heat waves impactful and most impactful may depend on which species you're talking about, as Ray brought up earlier. One of the, I think, really interesting debates in the marine heat wave world right now has to do with what we use as a baseline. Sort of historically, the baseline has been fixed based on some historical period in time. I'm guessing that Mark Eakin talked to you a couple days ago about the degree heating weeks used for defining heat waves for corals based on a fixed historical baseline. And but there was also this really interesting paper just last year, came out in Nature. It was sort of a perspective piece led by Dylan Amaya and a number of other colleagues, many of them in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. But their point is that the field of marine heat waves right now is using a couple different definitions of how we define baselines, and that really affects what we call a heat wave and what we don't call a heat wave, especially going forward as average ocean temperatures continue to warm. So if you see on the left, if we use a fixed historical baseline that doesn't change, as average temperature goes up, eventually we'll be in a state where we're constantly in marine heat waves. Maybe this is something that you've already been discussing over the course of this week, because I do think it's a really interesting topic and sort of definition question that we're grappling with. Whereas the other way of thinking about the baseline is that it should be, maybe it's, we define some period of time, maybe it's 30 years, but it's rolling. It's like 30 years before the present, not 30 years fixed at some point in the past. And so that's the example shown on the right, where yes, average temperatures may warm, but the heat waves are going to be beyond that moving threshold that also is warming as average temperatures go up. Which one is most relevant is going to, from a biological point of view, depends a bit on, or it depends a lot actually, on the extent to which species adapt. So if there's zero adaptation, then maybe a fixed baseline makes sense to from some perspective. But if there is some acclimation, physiological plasticity, adaptive evolution, shifts in species ranges, turnover in species composition, then a moving threshold probably makes more sense, because the impact of a heat wave is going to depend on not just the heat wave right now, but also the history of temperatures that have affected that ecological system up until now. And at least for me as a biologist, conceptually, it's actually easier to think about heat waves and warming of average temperatures as two different components that we're going to think about, and keep those somewhat separate, that there's the average warming and then there's also this variability. And we need to think about them both, but let's not mash them together into the same marine heat wave definition. So at least in my mind as a biologist, the figure on the right where we have a rolling baseline makes more sense. Be curious what all of you think, since you've been, I'm sure, grappling with this for the last week or so, and probably will for the rest of the week. This figure right here makes that similar point, but with the sort of added piece of it, the biological relevance depends a bit on how fast the biological systems and these ecosystems are adapting. And I use adapting in a very broad sense. Yes, maybe it's evolutionary. Yes, maybe it's physiological, but it could also be turnover in species composition. And so the threshold at which a marine heat wave becomes impactful would stay flat if there's no adaptation. That's the black line. But if that system is adapting through time and it's able to adapt at the same speed that warming is happening, then the threshold above which a marine heat wave has a big biological impact will also rise, and that would be the green line. And there might be something in between with the purple line, sort of slow adaptation there in the middle. Okay. In terms of making inference about whether marine heat waves in general have a large biological impact, you could think about a few different cases. If we have some years without heat waves and we see no ecological impact, and some years with heat waves shown on the right there, where they have some big biological impact, however you want to measure that. Maybe it's mortality, maybe it's turnover in species composition, maybe it's shift in species distribution. Define that however you want. This would be a really clear case. We might also have a case, though, where years without heat waves also sometimes have maybe big turnover in species composition, or maybe big mortality events also happen in years without marine heat waves for other reasons that don't have to do with heat waves. That could be another case, but then we'd say that marine heat waves are a factor that can have large impacts, that there are other factors that can also have large impacts. We might also have a case, though, where years with marine heat waves, some of them also don't show a large ecological impact. Maybe there are some marine heat wave years that don't have a big mortality event, or some marine heat wave years that don't have a big turnover in species composition. That also changes how we think about the biological impacts of marine heat waves. We might, in some ways, say that there are some silent heat waves that didn't have a big impact. Right now, I think in many cases, we're in this case right now, where, at least what we know about, there have been some heat waves, and we've seen some really big biological impacts. Seabird mortality events, big shifts in where right whales are, bleaching and mortality of corals. A lot has been reported in the biological literature. A few years ago, though, a number of colleagues and I wanted to actually test a little more generally. Rather than taking a case where we had a big impact and could tie that to a marine heat wave, we wanted to test across a whole bunch of years, some of which had marine heat waves, some of which didn't, and understand whether marine heat wave years in general had large biological impacts. So, in some ways, it's asking how repeatable are marine heat wave impacts, and based on that, might we be able to predict which marine heat waves are most impactful? So this gets to some research we've done trying to detect marine heat wave impacts across continental shelf ecosystems. And I'm going to skip through this part a little bit quickly, just based on the time, but this research pulls from a large collaborative research project between different groups that conduct scientific surveys on continental shelves around the world. It's a project called Fish Globe, and it's a consortium that pulls together folks who conduct the surveys with other folks who are experts in data science and open science, making these kinds of data interoperable so they can be compared across slightly different survey techniques and different ecosystems. One of the really exciting things about these surveys is that they cover thousands of species, both marine fishes and invertebrates. The marine fishes tend to be best surveyed, so what I'll show you today is all just focused on marine fishes. They go back a half century. Many of these surveys started in the 1960s and 1970s, and they're conducted in most cases every single year. So they cover a large part of the continental shelf of the world, actually on every continent, including the subantarctic. These are, as I mentioned, bottom trawl surveys. So they drag a large net behind a boat and they pull it up, count and weigh what they catch. They're often designed in a, typically designed in a stratified random design, so that they survey the full survey region with randomly selected survey points each year, so we can make scientific inference and statistical inference independent from what, say, a commercial fishing operation might do, where they go out and just go where they think the most fish are going to be. That's an important distinction. There are a number of the individuals on the steering committee for Fish Globe. Aurore Moreau in the middle on the bottom row has been one of the leading motivators behind pulling all of this together. She's an early career researcher based in France right now, also collaborating with the Global Change Research Group. These kinds of efforts, though, involve many people across many countries. One of the first scientific papers included many dozen co-authors, shown here. I also want to make the point that continental shelves, so these are the shallow, very productive parts of the ocean close to the coast, historically very important to human society as well. It's where most fishery catches come from as well, parts of the ocean that most interact with human society, both impacted by what we do, but also providing benefits to humans. These are also ecosystems, and these are also data sets that have been very effective for revealing long-term ecological changes, including shifts in species distribution. That's an example on the left, and also turnover in species composition. There's an example on the right there. I'm happy to talk about that later if you want. So Alexa Fredston, who's now in the Ocean Sciences Department here at UC Santa Cruz, led an analysis of marine heat wave impacts. So the first thing she did was go back and, for all of the ecosystems covered by bottom trawl surveys, identified which had experienced marine heat waves and when did they happen. She used something very similar to the Hobday definition. So in this case, using a seasonally varying 95th percentile of historical sea surface or sea bottom temperatures. She did it two different ways, either with a fixed baseline or with a moving baseline, and identified nearly 250 marine heat waves that affected these ecosystems over that period of time. And we characterize them based on cumulative intensity, but also duration. And this plot shows some of those results. So on the x-axis, we see marine heat wave cumulative intensity, so increasing to the right, up to some very intense marine heat waves. Higher on this graph shows heat wave years that also recorded an increase in biomass within these surveys. Low on this graph are years that had a large decrease in biomass just after a marine heat wave. And we see that, yes, some of these heat waves were characterized by substantial declines in biomass on the continental shelves. Gulf of Alaska in 2017, so a bit after the warm blob as one example. What we were really surprised, though, is that was not by any means a general pattern across marine heat waves. If we just did the binary classification of marine heat wave year or not, that's the two density distributions on the right side of the graph. Marine heat wave years shown in red, non-marine heat wave years shown in blue, no difference. But also there's no evidence that the impact of those marine heat wave years increased with the intensity of the marine heat waves. So we know some had big impacts, but there are also a lot that didn't. We also didn't see any general increase in variation after marine heat waves. I will say we looked at a whole bunch of other things, including changes in species composition, other definitions of marine heat waves, and while there are heat waves that had large impacts, there are not general impacts of marine heat waves in these ecosystems. At least as a field, we've been defining marine heat waves. We did a bunch of work to figure out how much power we have to detect a decline in biomass after marine heat wave. And based on the data sets and the sampling variance, we had power to detect at least a 9% decline in these ecosystems. So we're at this state, at least for continental shelf ecosystems, where we have some very large reported impacts. So those are shown in dark purple, but a lot of heat waves that have happened that apparently have not been reported and also did not have a large ecological impact, at least as we can detect from these observational data sets. So I think this leaves us in a really interesting place. And I know Ray is really interested in trying to dig into this question a bit more. Is about what makes some of these heat waves impactful and others apparently not so impactful. You know, is it that it's not just temperature that matters? Maybe it's the combination of temperature and low oxygen or low productivity. Maybe it's that the species that are surveyed in these, that are captured in these surveys, so especially marine fishes, maybe they're mobile enough so that behavioral thermoregulation and moving to deeper depths during a heat wave has allowed them to avoid longer term impacts of the heat wave. These surveys happen every year, so we're detecting impacts, you know, trying to detect impacts in general, you know, a few months or about a year after that heat wave hit. Maybe there are impacts, but they're just relatively small, sort of less than that 9% threshold that we were likely to detect. Or maybe there are certain ecosystems, you know, maybe it's something about the food chain structure or other composition within an ecosystem that makes them more vulnerable to the impacts of a heat wave. I think these are all really interesting questions that are still open. I did want to say that the Fish Globe data set is all online. There's actually a whole data paper describing it, but that QR code on the left takes you to the GitHub website that has a lot, the codes and the data. If you're interested in digging into this, the QR code on the right goes to the analyses for the marine heat waves paper that I just talked about. And just to finish up, point out that there are a range of mechanisms that are important. They operate over scales from days to decades, spatial scales from centimeters up to thousands of kilometers. We know that these heat waves can be impactful, but there also seem to be many marine heat waves that did not have large impacts. And how, especially marine fishes on continental shelves, are responding to those is still a really fascinating and open question. And as we scale up to predict long-term change, we need to understand not only this response, we need to be able to integrate these responses together, both the long-term average changes and these short-term responses. Some open questions that I'll leave you with. Lots of folks to thank, including folks in the Global Change Research Group that really make all of this possible. And I'll leave you with those open questions. Happy to take questions if we've got any time. Thanks for listening.
So Malin, I have a question. So you're looking at the demersal fish, but it'd be an interesting comparison with pelagics, right? Because the demersal fish, I would imagine that they're most vulnerable in their younger stages, particularly like in their larval and juvenile stages when they're up in the water column, particularly if you're looking at surface marine heat waves, whereas if you're looking at, you know, more pelagic species, herring, anchovy, sardines, you might see a different story. So that would be an interesting comparison. I don't know. Has your group looked at that?
So these surveys do capture some pelagic species, but as you can imagine, not as well, right? Because they are demersal bottom trawls. So some of the data sets aren't quite as clear. We haven't specifically broken those out, but we have. One of the things we did do was look actually at bottom heat waves. So not just surface marine heat waves, but actually look at the bottom temperature records as best as they can be reconstructed from historical reanalyses. So even the bottom heat waves affecting the bottom layer of the ocean on the continental shelf do not seem to have strong impacts. Yeah, so that's what's led us to think about, maybe it's behavioral thermoregulation or other mechanisms that some of these demersal species are coping with these heat waves. But I agree, the more mobile species would also be interesting to dig into more specifically.
When you were looking at the intensity, were you looking at sort of degree heating days, or what was your measure?
Yeah, we were looking at degree heating days. And we also looked at duration.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, some of the things we've seen is that the bottom marine heat waves often tend to be of longer duration. So of course, that's going to mean that maybe the temperatures aren't, for any given marine heating day measurement, it may be that the duration is what's driving the intensity, and the temperatures may not be quite as extreme. So anyway, just random
Exactly.
thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is exactly, I think, sort of what the stage that we're at. It's like now it's the hypothesis generation stage of like, okay, what is going on? What does define an impactful marine heat wave, at least for these ecosystems?
Keep an eye out for questions on the chat, but others can jump in and ask Malin questions.
Erica.
Hi. Do we have feedback?
I think I can probably hear you even if you don't unmute yourself.
I'm gonna yell.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so this is me wanting disagreeing for the sake of an interesting conversation. You had mentioned, okay, well, I'm a biologist and I would argue for this rolling baseline definition of a marine heat wave. And that kind of surprised me because I'm also a biologist and I would argue in the other direction.
Nice.
These systems are not perfectly responsive. They're not perfectly plastic, and it takes a long time for species and ecosystems to adapt to this new baseline. And so I'm wondering, I don't know, I'm thinking of that meme of like, change my mind. Like, how would you convince me otherwise? And is there any sort of maybe weighting schema that could thread the needle between what I'm saying and what you're saying?
Yeah, so one of the wonderful things is we can keep talking about this. But I would say that from an inference perspective and a biological perspective, I don't want to get confused between the long-term warming that a system is experiencing and the event scale of a marine heat wave. And if we use a fixed baseline based on, say, 1980 to 2010, eventually every year is going to be defined as a marine heat wave. And what biological meaning does that have? Like, as a biologist, I've got now no contrast to compare against. If I'm interested in what are the impacts of a hot event as opposed to long-term warming. Whereas if we keep them separate and use a rolling baseline, we can decompose that into, here's a warm event that's unusual for the last 30 years compared to, yes, there's also been this long-term warming maybe over 50, 60 years that the system has to some extent adapted to, though as we all know, it's unlikely to be complete. So I think from a research perspective, it's helpful to keep them separate. That's at least one argument.
Yeah.
I have a question for when you said you found no trend in the biomass based on how we define marine heat waves.
Mhm.
Did you guys look at other definitions based on these limits for like what you would expect to really impact certain fish?
So we explored a range of definitions, but we also, eventually we had to call it good and say, that's going to have to be another project to like go back to square one and redefine what makes them, and can we detect what makes a high temperature event impactful. I think there might be some interesting approaches using machine learning as one example, and it might, as I mentioned, also mean pulling in more than just temperature records, but also oxygen records or records of ocean productivity. So we started with the sort of 5-day definition of a marine heat wave above a seasonally varying 95th percentile of historical temperatures. And then we define them also based on, we didn't just define them as heat wave or not, but we looked at cumulative intensity, we looked at heat wave duration, we defined them with a fixed historical baseline or a rolling window baseline as well. We define them based on surface temperatures. We define them based on bottom temperatures. That's what I'm remembering. And I mean, one of the fun things that'd be fun to hear from all of you, maybe not right now, but maybe at the end of the week, you can send ideas back with Ray or Erica. How else should we be defining them? Maybe that, Chuck was throwing out some ideas already, but there are probably other things that we can explore to try to figure this out. Looks like Yifan has a question. Hey, Yifan.
Hello, Malin. Yes, I
Hi.
do have a question. Hello. In one of your slides, you mentioned the compounding event. That's where we are very much interested in, and we are building our project using Glory's global reanalysis data. We are actually working with Ray this week on that topic. So I think at some point we may have offline discussion about it, because especially on shelf ecosystem, there might be compound event, that multi-stressor, that is, a marine heat wave is only one stressor. Sometimes they are exposed with multi-stressors, and that might be useful or more meaningful to look at.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that would be fascinating. I'd love to talk more. And one of the things I didn't mention is that, so one of the consequences of high temperatures are that metabolic rates go up. And so an organism's demand for oxygen and also an organism's demand for food also go up. So if there's high temperature and low oxygen, or high temperature and low food availability, that would lead to even stronger biological impacts. So that's part of the reason those compound events are interesting. Goes back to basic organismal physiology. Cool. Be fun to hear more.
Malin, in those sort of shifting baselines of marine heat waves that you were talking about, have you tried thinking about ways that you might try to scale that by the lifespan of the particular organisms? And if so, what kinds of things have you tried?
Mm. I haven't tried anything, but it's an interesting idea. I think I worry a little bit about ending up with such a wide range of marine heat wave definitions that it gets hard to communicate. I think Andy talked a bit about marine heat wave communication and sort of that as a communication tool. It is helpful, but scaling based on generation time could make a lot of sense.
Well, I mean, it might be interesting to, kind of have the extremes where you don't account for the trend, and then where you do account for the trend, and then have sort of organism specific ones, that are gonna fall between those extremes. Because, if you're looking at corals, for example, it's going to be a whole lot different than the way phytoplankton are going to respond. And as you look at those differences, I mean, what's a marine heat wave to one is clearly may not be a marine heat wave at all from the other's perspective. So I'm just thinking, yes, it does complicate matters, but if you want to look at the, kind of split the ecosystem up into, its components and define the marine heat waves that each of those components experiences, it might be really informative.
No, I think I agree. And I think the key consideration there, I think, is which processes we want to account for. Because if we're interested in sort of community level processes, then we probably want to think about lifespan and the turnover in species composition. And so it might make sense to sort of put together guilds of species with similar lifespans to the extent that makes sense. But marine fishes versus phytoplankton, okay, there are big distinctions there. If we're thinking about impacts on individual species, and it's a question of, I guess, adaptive evolution, then we'd scale based on generation time. And again, phytoplankton, fast generation time, but it's not quite that simple, because even if generation time is fast, doesn't mean that they can evolutionarily adapt to keep up. There's probably quite a bit of species turnover that's happening at that scale as well. But I do think there's probably something interesting that could be done. I will also say that there's been some really interesting work showing that corals would be bleaching, even corals, sort of this classic case that we don't think are adapting fast enough. Even corals would be bleaching a lot more frequently right now than they are if they had not adapted. So even with corals, there seems to be some evidence that there's adaptation happening. And that was based on some work that Cheryl Logan did quite a few years ago. So we know that adaptation is happening across many different systems. And that's probably to the long-term change.
Well, yeah, I mean, clearly there's very strong selection on corals right now, right?
Exactly. So, unfortunately, yeah. And also, Chuck, I don't know how long you want to do questions. I'm happy to keep answering questions, but I also don't know if you have other things planned. I know we'd.
Let's make sure everybody that wants to has had their chance. So raise your hand if you still want to ask.
Yes, I got a question.
Okay, one more.
Yeah, definitely.
So Way's gonna ask you a question.
Hey, May.
Hi.
Yeah, let's talk. Oh, okay.
You can turn your volume, mute yourself.
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, just the difference between global warming and heat waves. I think this is very important for our research, because heat waves is actually embedded in global warming, right? the rising temperature, the mean state temperature is rising. And then we have more marine, not only marine liquid, but also the net liquids, right? So how can we identify, or isolate these two differences in terms of ecosystems, especially for the long term, right? It's hard to, isolate these two impacts.
Sorry, I missed a few words in there, but I think the question was about how do we separate out the biological impacts of long-term warming versus marine heat wave events?
Yes, because mean state impact and extreme event impact. I think it's critical to isolate these two impacts, right?
Yeah. I mean, part of it is that, they don't operate completely independently. But we do, you do expect those heat wave impacts to appear right after and in the years after a marine heat wave occurs. So having those biological time series to understand when those impacts appear, and are they appearing after a marine heat wave, or are they appearing very slowly, even in years that aren't necessarily heat waves, but are just sort of cumulatively getting warmer. That is part of the way that we can start to separate out the two kinds of impacts. On the other hand, we also, I think Alistair may have introduced this early on, some of the impacts of long-term warming may also accumulate through discrete events. So they're not entirely independent. But it's also, I think the other key consideration is what happens after a marine heat wave event. Does it recover? To what extent? To what state does it recover back to? Is it recovering back to what you'd expect from that long-term warming trend, or recover back to something else? Is it more of are they acting like ratchets? Can sort of come up with different sort of cartoon images of how these responses biologically might accumulate within a community. Series of step events driven by events, or just slow, gradual impacts accumulating, or maybe tracking every up and down of temperature or physical state in the ocean. Because you expect, if it's tracking every event, you'd also expect a cool event to have a big impact, just in the other direction.
Well, Malin, thank you. You've
Great
certainly
question.
given us a lot of food for thought. And if we come up with any really cool answers to the questions you raised, we'll let you know.
Please do. That was my goal, was to raise questions. So thank you.
Great.
Yeah, thanks for all the great questions, and look forward to hearing how the rest of the week goes.